Hey everybody, welcome to another installment of Serverless Office Hours. I'm your host, David Wells, and with us today we have Austin Collins. Austin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Austin Collins, the founder of Serverless Inc. I started the Serverless Framework over like a year and a half ago, and now I work with David and a great team of 11 people working on the framework full time and making lots of progress.
It's good times. And a special guest, we have James on the line. James from OpenWhisk. James, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hey, hello everybody. My name is James Thomas. I'm a developer advocate for IBM working in our cloud division. And for the past couple of months, I've been working with the guys at OpenWhisk to do some really interesting stuff, which we're going to announce shortly. So yeah, it's great to be on the show.
Cool. Glad you could make it. All right, we're going to give people a little bit of time to jump in the live stream. While I do that, I got to pop open the YouTube channel to monitor live comments. So if you guys do have any comments or questions, feel free to either tweet them at us at GoServerless with the hashtag AskServerless so we see them, or you can go ahead and ask in the YouTube live stream in a little chat box there. But cool. All right. So I got that open. All right. So we're going to jump into a couple of quick announcements before we dive into a little bit more about what's happening with the framework and some really cool features we want to talk about. But yeah, so James, looks like you have a quick recap shout out for the Serverless London meetup.
Yeah, I do. Last night was London Serverless, the first one of the year, and it was an excellent meetup. So kind of shout out to Anne Stanley for putting that together and everyone who kind of sponsored, hosted. There was, 50, 60 devs who are all kind of hardcore Serverless users, hearing about some talks. I talked about our new announcement that we did with the Serverless Framework, and we're showing that off. So it was great to get some feedback. I'll kind of dive into that later, so what that was. And then there were some of the developers talking about their kind of how they do production, Lambda deployments, and their CI and all their tools. So it was a great crowd and really knowledgeable, and it was just really good to kind of chat serverless with everybody that was there. So it's going to be a monthly thing now, so it's very exciting to see this community forming, and it's a huge area of growth at the moment. And it was interesting to see people across all different industries using serverless frameworks and platforms. It wasn't just what people think of, startups, because the cost is so performant. There's financial services, there's banking, there's client services. So yeah, it was huge. It was awesome.
Nice. Yeah, it's awesome to see kind of the meetup community growing around serverless, because as you said, it's kind of a hot topic. And yeah, if anybody watching is interested in getting involved or starting a meetup in your area, feel free to reach out to us, and we have like a huge guide and kind of ways to help you do that.
Hey James, at that meetup, was there anyone there with a pretty cool use case?
That's a good question. Was anyone there with pretty cool? Yeah, there was actually. Well, there was many people. Service is pretty cool. I was talking to a developer from the Guardian, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the UK and very digital focused, very tech first. And they recently published a really cool Alexa skill for their newspaper, which I use at home. So I was quite impressed with this, and it runs on Lambda. And they're actually compiling, they're running Scala code using obviously the Java runtime on Lambda to be able to do this. So yeah, that's what they implemented for their Alexa skill. It's a really popular skill on the App Store. I use it as well, so it's kind of nice to meet the developers and hear about the kind of what they would do with it and some of their challenges. And Java cold starts was a kind of popular issue for people that they were running into. So I thought that was a great use case for serverless. We know Alexa is a kind of good on-ramp for serverless and Lambda for people.
What was it again? Was it a flash briefing?
No, it wasn't a flash briefing. They have just a skill, a straight up skill that you install, so you can say, ask the Guardian to tell me sport or to tell me headlines. It's quite in depth and it works quite well. So it's the whole newspaper over your Echo, your Echo Dot.
That sounds cool. I'll check it out.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. Awesome. And then we have one other quick announcement. We're having a San Francisco meetup. So if you are in the Bay Area, on February 22nd at HeavyBit, we got a couple awesome talks lined up there. Single page apps and all going serverless with Jared Short from Trek 10, which is an awesome kind of partner agency we work with, doing some cool serverless stuff. And then we also have when keeping it serverless goes wrong, the view from the ops side of the house from our friends over at IO Pipes, Michael Ford over there. So that should be cool, and we will be recording that as well. So if you can't make it in person, we'll obviously be sharing out those links. But yeah, so those are kind of the quick announcements. Let's jump into some of the new kind of framework features and releases, and then segue into the main reason James is here to talk about something super cool. I don't want to spoil it yet, though.
Yeah, don't reveal.
You gotta build up the suspense. I find, you know, people really like that. Cool. So with the serverless version 1.6 release, drum roll, we had the OpenWhisk plugin added. So we now have support for OpenWhisk. And back to a couple of the announcements that kind of fall into this. We have a blog post all about the integration and a lot of OpenWhisk examples on the serverless github.com/serverless/examples repo. But James, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit of background about it? And
I can. I'll tell you the history of the plugin. You know, a long time ago, last summer, I was kind of playing with the serverless framework, and I've been kind of working with OpenWhisk, which is IBM's open source serverless platform. And I love the framework, but obviously it was Lambda focused, because that was where serverless kind of came from, right? Amazon was the first to the market. And when I was digging around in your repo and I was looking through the issues list, I saw that someone had submitted a pull request for another provider. And I see the framework team had been doing some work to kind of make it possible for other providers to kind of get involved and provide an implementation. So I decided that I would kind of have a go at providing an implementation for OpenWhisk. And obviously, you know, you've done some really good things to make it quite easy to do. It's just a kind of normal plugin, so people are kind of familiar with building normal serverless plugins. It's that same mechanism, some hooks you hook into to package up and deploy your app. And we had some nice CLI tools already available for OpenWhisk in a client library, so that was kind of already taken care of. And relatively quickly, I was able to get a completely new provider for the serverless framework. So when you type serverless deploy, now it talks to a non-AWS provider, but the workflow and the commands are all the same. So for a developer, it makes the switching cost between providers really, really low. So I submitted the first pull request to you guys at the sort of end of summer last year, and then there was some architectural changes in the framework, so we went back and forward and kind of updated it. And that was good because it gave me more time to fill things out, like examples of documentation, and add more features. And our platform, the OpenWhisk platform, has been moving very, very quickly as well, so there were some things to do. So after version 1 came out, obviously we kind of hunkered down to get this out. And yeah, as of Monday, when 1.6 came out, now OpenWhisk, I'm kind of proud to say, is the first provider to provide a full implementation that allows developers to choose which platform to deploy to. So just really, really simply, by changing the manifest and installing the plugin, you can target an OpenWhisk endpoint, whether that is the hosted version that we run for you on IBM's cloud, or because it's open source, one that you're running yourself, or another provider. So yeah, I think it's just a fantastic opportunity for developers. You know, it means that, as I said, the switching costs are much, much lower. So you might think, oh, well, maybe I want to go use another serverless runtime because it's got different runtimes, or maybe it's open source, or maybe it's available in a different geography. You know, last year we saw pretty much all of the big cloud providers, I think, launch their own serverless platforms. So you've got OpenWhisk, which came from IBM and is now part of Apache. You've got Azure Functions, you've got Google Cloud Functions, you've got IO. Fission has come out based on Kubernetes. But I think one of the concerns people have is, well, maybe I want to go and use a different runtime that's available on a different provider, but do I really have to learn that entire provider's stack and how you configure an API gateway? You know, and I want to take my tooling with me because it makes me much more productive. So I think this feature is fantastic because rather than the devs having to now know an entire new stack, they can, with a couple of config changes, get their apps and start to try out new providers and take advantage of all this kind of competition that's going on in the serverless space. Yeah. So yeah, it was super exciting to get it out. We obviously saw huge amounts of traffic on Monday when we put the announcement out between Serverless and IBM and OpenWhisk. And we've seen people using it already and giving feedback. So we've got lots of plans. I've had lots of issues open in the project to add things in to make it kind of feature complete. So it'll be really interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, I'm super excited that this happened. I mean, I know it's been such a long road to get it in there, and it's the first one that we've added in, and it's people have been asking for it. But for people that aren't necessarily familiar with OpenWhisk, can we talk a little bit about maybe some of the differences, or how is it similar to other providers? Just a little bit of background.
Absolutely.
Also, where does the title come from?
Yeah, that is a good question. Where does the title come from? I don't know. Often internally we refer to ourselves as whiskers, like whiskers. The whisk team. People will say I'm whisking. So I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe I'll ask on Slack and find out and tell you. The history really was, I think obviously we know Lambda, in the beginning there was Lambda, right? Amazon was first to the market and kind of really defined this whole new serverless thing. And I think all the providers kind of suddenly started to realize the benefits of building kind of applications in this truly cloud native way with this utility model. And so IBM came out with our own service solution I think it was announced in February last year. So it's still just under 12 months old. And one of the differentiators for us was that we think that developers are very concerned about lock into one platform, right? They're going to be tied to some proprietary cloud API and they're never going to be able to get off if they turn it off, like Pass.com, or maybe they change their pricing model or something. So one of the ways we think that we can mitigate that is by building our cloud platforms on open source components. IBM was heavily invested in things like Cloud Foundry with Bluemix. And so we took the decision to open source OpenWhisk, and I think that's a good way for developers to kind of reduce some of that pain around vendor lock-in. So from the beginning, the whole platform was open sourced. It was all up on GitHub, and the team continued to work in the open. So all the development was done in the open. You could look at the issues list and see what was going on, submit pull requests, get involved in the community. And I think that's been a really, really positive thing, and is I would say a key differentiator, especially early when some of the other platforms came out that kind of set us apart. So they've continued kind of building and working on it. As I said, it's open source, so you can just pull it down and run the whole platform locally. You could deploy it yourself if you wanted to any provider, IaaS provider, or you can come and actually have a kind of hosted solution, which we kind of provide out of the box on IBM Bluemix with some extra tools and services. So that would be our kind of value add. And as part of our commitment to open source, we wanted it not to just be an IBM open source project. So at the end of last year, we've done the announcement that it's been donated, or it's being donated to Apache, and it's a proposed project. It's going through that full foundation incubation phase. We've got some other companies now working to use it. So we hope to kind of stand it up and make it a fully kind of independent open source community. And I think you've seen, interestingly, lots of other now open source serverless frameworks come along. So things like Fission, which builds on Kubernetes. You've got, I think, RNIO and some of the other ones. So there seems to be more and more interest in the space of kind of serverless platforms for various reasons. So, if you're already heavily invested in something like Kubernetes, could you add something on quickly to have a more serverless kind of approach? And also, I guess, the vendor lock-in. So that's where it kind of came from. And yeah, it's it's kind of becoming very popular.
I think it's really interesting that you can run it kind of on premise out of the box. I think that's a big selling point for a lot of big enterprises. Quick question: what are the different runtimes that it supports right now?
Yeah, so I think when I look across all the service providers, I call it like the big three. I think most of them support Node, which is first-class language out of the box. I think Python is also a popular one, and then most of them seem to also support Java. So all of those versions are in there. For Node, it's version 6.9.1. It's whatever the latest kind of releases. We track quite heavily the latest Node release. Python 2.7, Java 8 is in there. An interesting first-class language that comes out of the box is Swift Lang. So Swift was a language that was developed by Apple, originally just for kind of native iOS apps, and they've open sourced it. And IBM's been kind of heavily involved in it and building out things like the web service and the frameworks for building it and a package manager. And it's become a very popular language in its own right for doing just about any task with. So we added Swift in there straight out of the box because we think for developers who are comfortable using it to build native mobile apps, often what they want to do is then build some backend APIs. I think backend mobile APIs is a great use case for serverless, and so they can use the same language. So out of the box, we've got the big three, we've got Swift, but because it's open source, it's extensible. So you can actually push raw Docker containers or images into the platform with some constraints to execute kind of anything on demand. Or we also support pushing kind of binaries up. So as long as your binary is compiled for the particular image that we use, you don't have to use like a node shim to wrap it out. You can just push it up. So for Go, or I did one with Rust recently, you just compile it down to binary and push it up and kind of execute it on demand. So I think that's, I'd say, one of the advantages of being a more open platform is it's very easy to extend for pretty much any runtime.
Yeah, I love how OpenWhisk or IBM approached this whole problem. They kind of realized that it's not just about functions. That's only half the story.
Mm-hmm.
A big part of the serverless architecture, the serverless theme, is just event-driven computing. And so they open sourced this whole platform, which the functions are only a component of, but it also gives you that kind of event-driven architecture or infrastructure that you can move around and port elsewhere. And I think that was just a pretty good approach to everything. And then they allowed you to use Docker right out of the box. Just been super impressed that IBM has done all this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a couple of other things that are, I was not involved in the development of the platform of kind of advocacy, and I just, I love this serverless thing, right? And then OpenWhisk came out, and so I've just, we have Slack at work, and I just found their channel. I haven't left them alone since. But the team came from IBM Research, and they were all heavily involved in kind of programming language development. So they're super smart guys, and they've got lots of experience of building programming languages and how they work on the concepts. And I think you're starting to see some of that influence the kind of direction of the platform. So one of the interesting features, I think, is they have some higher level constructs. So as well as just defining raw functions, right, you can define what they call sequences, which is a function which is comprised of other functions being called in sequence. So rather than having for you to write some boilerplate code to actually, use an SDK, call this function, call another, you can actually use the platform to do that. And I think you're going to see, this is an interesting model of surfacing some kind of higher level programming constructs in the platform as like raw elements that then tooling can build on top of. So yeah, I think their kind of knowledge and background in that area is helping them think about, it's not just about functions, it's construction, it's how you join them together, it's you handle errors and that kind of stuff.
Are sequences another feature that I saw that I was super excited about, because we see a lot of people building pretty complex workflows with the serverless framework, and just doing all types of workflows with AWS Lambda in general. And it's such a powerful capability. And the idea that you provide some type of structure or framework for building out these sequences in OpenWhisk is really interesting. Our audience is pretty AWS focused. Are sequences like AWS's new step functions? Yeah,
there's some similarity. And I think this comes to a common question that a concern that you get into with a lot of developers is, serverless is great and you can get up and going with any platform really quickly for a couple of functions. But then when you want to build bigger applications, because it's such an emerging space, right? What are the patterns? What are the architectures? How do you compose and manage errors and that kind of stuff? So I think you're seeing people start to try and provide some solutions to this. And I think step functions is a way to kind of manage that. Sequences was one way to kind of do some construction. So yeah, I think if you're familiar with step functions, it has some overlap. Right? I think step functions goes way beyond it, because it has lots more things like state management and retries, whereas sequences is much more like a primitive of the platform. It's not an extra tool that's built on top of it.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. How is state handled with sequences, or maybe it's not handled at all?
Yeah, no, it's a very small. It's more like a primitive. So yeah, it's more like a primitive. So there's no state associated with it at the moment.
Cool, cool. So how actually that's a good question as well. Like how are people managing state on IBM and OpenWhisk?
Yeah, so I guess they manage state mostly through the extra services that you can provide on the platform. So, just like Lambda or Azure Functions, you obviously can connect your functions to be invoked based on external events that occur, whether it's some API gateway request coming in, or a message on a queue, or a database update. And then obviously, one of the advantages, I guess, of running your serverless platform as on a managed service is that you get access to the rest of the platform and all the databases and queue services that you can just provision on the fly and talk to. So most people seem to be using those kind of things, just cloud APIs, extra SaaS things to be able to handle their state for them.
Is there a temporary disk space, kind of like in Lambda, where you can stash? You can't really rely on it, but you can stash.
Yeah. So it's the same kind of method where while your container's warm, you can access that kind of cache, that disk cache, right? But obviously, if it runs out or it gets cold, then the instance gets killed. There'd be dragons and that kind of thing. So yeah, you get the same kind of implication. And the kind of nice thing about, I guess, an open source platform is that you can dig into how it works, right? So yeah, if you want to interested in exactly how it works, you can just go and look and pull down the containers locally and spin the things up. So yes.
Cool. I got a question for you, James. Can you run OpenWhisk on-prem and run a hosted version of OpenWhisk on IBM and have those things work together and communicate with each other?
Yeah. So that's the short answer is yes. The longer answer is OpenWhisk has a platform. It has an API basically for the entire platform. And if you go onto GitHub, there's a Swagger doc with the whole platform API. And when you're using something like the CLI or some of the web tools that are kind of extra to it, all they're doing under the covers is talking to this platform API. So from an OpenWhisk kind of deployment point of view, there is no difference between an instance that, whether you're using it on IBM's cloud, on the one that we've deployed for you, or whether you're just literally running it on your laptop in a VM, you just get this API to talk to that then the CLI tool knows how to communicate with, and that's what the OpenWhisk serverless plugin uses. It just uses the SDK that I wrote to talk to this platform API. So you can run it wherever you want, and there's no differentiation between it. It's just this public REST API that we have for kind of doing things like, deploy my code, invoke my code, create a package, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's one of the nice things. There's no differentiator. It's just, here's your API for the platform, and if you want to speak to another instance of the platform, you just change the endpoint. Nothing else has to change.
Cool. We have a live question from YouTube from Kim, and it is: are cold boots something you also have to deal with in OpenWhisk?
Yes. Yeah, they are. It's a similar kind of implementation method where they have a kind of container pool, right, for each of the runtimes, and depending on the contention and how recent your identification has been for your function, it works the very same way to Lambda. There's warm and cold kind of start times based on how recent your function's been called.
Cool. So if I wanted to get started with OpenWhisk, where would I go? What should I do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to do is you can go and have a look at openwhisk.org, which is the new website, which kind of gives you a good overview of the project. I think the easiest thing to do, I think, is to sign up for an account on Bluemix, which is IBM's cloud. You get a free tier for your serverless OpenWhisk instance. It's kind of provisioned out of the box. It's all ready for you to go. It's the same. It's like 400,000 gigabyte seconds. That kind of mad number. But it's a significant amount of free tiers, so you can play around to your heart's content for no charge. You don't have to put your credit card in.
Nice.
Or if you go to the GitHub page, or if you go to OpenWhisk on GitHub, and the OpenWhisk repo, there's 3 commands, and you can check out the repo and spin up a Vagrant VM locally. and it will do all the build and spin up the full platform. And in about like 10 or 15 minutes, you could have the whole thing running locally. And we're also doing some work now to push the Docker images that actually are the platform under the cover out to Docker Hub, so you can actually Docker compose up the whole platform. And there's a repo on OpenWhisk org showing you how to do that. So I think the easiest way is just to obviously use a hosted solution, but if you want to do it locally, then you can do that as well.
Cool. You had me at a generous free tier. I will.
Yeah, that's it. See, the benefit of using the Serverless Framework multi-providers is you can use the free tier from every single provider and just kind of move around, which is for developers pretty awesome, not so much for providers.
How long does it take someone to get signed up with a BlueMix? Because our biggest problem is just we build this tooling on top of these other cloud providers, and these other cloud providers, getting set up on them is way too complex. We lose so many of our users, and we're tracking them, from when they do the installation to, and we see where they drop off. And it's such a notorious problem when I've talked to AWS about this, and the Azure team and the Google team, I think. So how long does it take to get signed up? And is there any way it could be done faster?
Yeah, I haven't been through the sign-up process for a while, but I know it's something obviously they're really, really focused on. And it's improved massively since BlueMix has kind of been a thing. So you can go and you can sign up externally. You don't need to put your credit card in to begin with either. So literally just an email address and your kind of name and a few basic details. And for the first 30 days, as I said, you don't need to put any payment credentials in at all. And you get a free tier, which gives access to OpenWhisk. Literally comes out of the box. You don't even have to provision it. It's just there in the UI. And it'll give you the instructions to get set up. And the free tier gives you all things like, there's lots of database services, there's caching services, there's queues. So it's a very kind of robust platform. So I would imagine it's pretty quick. It's pretty quick. But I haven't been through it in a while. But yeah, they really, OpenWhisk is literally there out of the box, and you just go in the UI, and it's already, you don't have to provision it, you don't have to set it up, and you just download the CLI tools, all right, and then you save your credentials, and then you're basically ready to go. So I hope pretty easy. But if people have problems signing up and they find it difficult, then you can find me on Twitter and shout out, and then I will complain at people.
Good. Yeah. David, how many people you think want to use our tools, and then they have to go sign up at AWS and deal with identity and access management?
Yeah.
And drop off?
It's a large number, and we're trying to we want to help the providers get more users. It's we're trying to help, but there's this one part of the process that we can't touch, and that's the setup process. So it looks pretty.
I can see that.
But Azure seemed pretty easy too. They had a hour trial or something.
Yeah, I saw that. They had some cool web tool, and it was you could just try out Azure functions without doing anything for free, which is I think was a great kind of adoption tool. So props to them.
Totally cool. So what's on the roadmap? Excuse me, for OpenWhisk. What's the future hold?
Well, you could find out yourself because it's all open, but I will tell you. So, API gateway support has just been introduced, which is awesome. So this is a feature that comes as part of the platform. It's not, you have to rely on an external API service. And at the moment, there's no charge for those because we're also experimental for the invocations. And I know if you're running on Lambda, the API gateway cost can often be kind of the significant cost of your app. So the platform will come with a kind of API gateway integration just as part of it. And it's kind of pluggable, as I understand, so other providers can be swapped in. So another provider on IBM's cloud might be swapped in, or you could add your own, but there's one kind of out of the box. And that's something they are working on right now to make it easier to kind of add public APIs. And actually that feature was something I recently added into the Serverless Framework plugin. So just like you do with Lambda, where you're events, HTTP, path, endpoint, you could do the same. It's the same format, and it works exactly the same. So you don't have to learn about the intricacies of our particular API gateway. They're also working on some changes to make it easier to return different content types, which is pretty interesting, but you'll have to watch and see. So those things are some of the things. Though I think the API gateway was a bit of a gap for a while, and now they've added a really, really nice, simple way to add HTTP endpoints. that is something that's coming on. I think it's really, really awesome. I was very happy to see that feature and that we could add it in. But yeah, as I said, everything actually, with the move to Apache, we now have to, obviously everything has to be in the open. So we have a very open roadmap on the Apache wiki, which you can go and kind of contribute and get involved. So yeah, there's not a lot of secret anymore. It's all in the open.
With OpenWhisk, I've seen lots of effort to be able to point to other providers and other platforms. And it sounds like that's part of this new API Gateway project as well. You mentioned something, you could just point endpoints to another provider to do something there. I'm curious, in this world where all the big providers have some type of function as a service offering, and the tooling that we're coming out with is making it easier to use those function as a service products across providers. I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are generally on kind of the serverless multi-provider architecture and what benefits could come out of that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. This was kind of the theme of my talk on Monday at Serverless London, was about how as developers can you build apps to target different platforms without having to learn the intricacies of every platform? How could you move? How easy is it realistically to move apps between different platforms? And I kind of I had a Game of Thrones metaphor which I took pretty far in the talk, as you always know if you saw my slides. But I think what I found was there's a core set of common features, I think, across all platforms, right? So obviously they run some functions, on demand into invocations. They have some common runtimes like Node and Python and Java. They have common event sources like HTTP events, like cron, like some kind of database thing in there as well. So you suddenly realize there's like a kind of standard set of features, I think, across all the providers, which means that actually, if you're building some web APIs on one provider, you can be pretty sure that actually if I do move to another provider, I'm probably going to be able to also have an API gateway and some functions on demand. So at a high level, I think conceptually it seems quite, a bit more straightforward. I kind of delve into some of the details in my talk of things like, well, the interface for each runtime is slightly different on every provider. So, if you think about how you return your function model.exports.handler, it's not super different, but it's a little bit different. So I pointed out all the big four and said this is what it looks like. Obviously, how you get data in and get data out is different. So in OpenWhisk, your JavaScript functions can return a promise, which is pretty cool because it's kind of modern JavaScript. So the rest of them seem to favor a more callback style approach, so that doesn't necessarily translate. Again, how do you get parameters in Azure functions? You get a parameter for every argument, I think. In OpenWhisk, you get an object with child properties. Lambda gives you 3 properties. So there's some stuff around that, which is where I think, and I kind of suggested, I think the frameworks could help with this, because really it's not too much that really I write my function in a kind of provider independent way, and then the framework kind of wraps it for my particular provider, right? Because they're all doing the same thing. They pass you some parameters in, and they wait for a response, right? And then they attach you to some properties, some global properties. So that was a kind of shout out to the frameworks to kind of step up and help with that. Runtimes as well is interesting. So core runtimes is like Node, Python, Java. Where they are trying to differentiate themselves is by supporting kind of more interesting runtimes. So Swift in OpenWhisk, F# in Azure functions, and that's obviously if you're using something a bit more esoteric, then it's a bit more difficult. Or if you want to run like Rust-Lang, which requires you to build a binary for the platform, obviously that's going to be the binary, architecture, the platform architecture is going to be provider specific. But again, frameworks could kind of do that for you. The event sources, although they have similar categories of events, the actual implementation is going to be very, very different. So, we know service is an emerging space. There's not a lot of standardization between the providers. So the actual kind of how you return an object and the properties for an API gateway on Lambda, is not probably going to match how it works on OpenWhisk. And that is something that you have to write more code. And the fourth thing I talked about was SDKs. So obviously, in your functions, you want to call other functions, you want to call services, and you will use the platform SDK to do this. That SDK is very provider specific, clearly. So that's going to require you to rip out loads of code, which is a pain. And I kind of showed that I was digging around in the serverless org and found this cool project called standard-lib Node.js, which was a kind of abstraction layer over the provider's SDK for invoking other functions. So you just say, invoke function A, and then, I guess under the covers, it's going to go and work out you're on Lambda, so I'll use the AWS SDK or I'm on OpenWhisk. And that would be a great abstraction layer. And it's kind of easily achievable. It would make loads of sense and would reduce switching costs. So I think, using the different providers gets much easier now. You've got things like Serverless Framework integration because I don't need to know the details. Moving simple apps is kind of fairly straightforward. Moving bigger apps is more difficult, right? So that requires you to re-architect some code. But I think with some more standardization around packaging and events and things, you might be able to get quite far.
Right. A good recap. We know these problems intimately.
Yeah.
And we're focused on them. And we've got a lot of upcoming announcements around these problems specifically, actually. Just curious, though, in this world of being able to leverage functions as a service across multiple providers, like what do you think the use cases are and the benefits?
Yeah. I think that I think some of the different reasons you would look at different providers is, you might be someone who's just really early into the serverless space, right? It's only available on Lambda, and so that's all you could do. But the rest of your company maybe is just all on Google Cloud or SoftLayer or IBM, or maybe you're on Azure. So you think there's performance benefits for having your service apps within the same data center, right, same region as the rest of your company, and now you could actually do that. Right. It may be that you want to use a particular runtime that's not available on one particular provider, so why don't I just use another one for that? Geographically, maybe it's my provider doesn't provide support in China region or America West, so I'll just use another provider. As I said, open source is now a consideration because you have that option. Maybe you don't want to be worried about being tied to a more kind of private vendor solution. So I think there's a number of different reasons why you would look at using a different provider from, the runtimes they support, where they are located, where the services you're calling are located, where your customers are. Maybe, you prefer to be on one that's open source. Maybe you think the way to build resiliency for your cloud apps is to be multi-provider, right? To have the same app kind of running in different clouds, and that's going to be your availability zones, right? And I think you could actually, start to think about that now, depending, and it depends on your use case of performance and latency and throughput and cost and all that kind of stuff. And also, as I said, cost is obviously an issue, right? As developers, it's great to have competition in the marketplace because evolution forces the providers to compete and makes it cheaper, right? But it's good for developers to have more choice.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I want to ask you about OpenWhisk's pricing and how it compares to Lambda and everything else. But before that, just a couple last thoughts on this theme of the serverless multi-provider architecture. I agree with everything you said. I think that there are a lot of use cases and a lot of benefits for this. And sometimes I hear the story being characterized as one of portability. But I don't know if portability is the real big story here because there is lock-in that happens, and it happens at the data layer, right? Yeah. And it's not that hard to move like a function to another provider. It's much harder to move the data, of course. Yeah. So portability in these functions of service, I'm not sure. I think we need to make it easier. I think we need to chip away at that and build that uniform experience so the developers don't have to think about provider quirks. They could just, leverage whatever they want. But I think the story here that excites me personally is not about portability, but possibility. This idea that I could have functions living on any provider. And functions as a service to me represent the most accessible path to adopting a provider and using its higher value services, its managed services. Like I want to use Google's machine learning stuff, but I may want to use some stuff on AWS. And one of the fastest ways to do that now is just to upload some code in the form of a function. And this is personally what excites me, this idea that I could use whatever I want, to take advantage of some feature or something, or some new type of high value service, so I could deliver results faster. because
Yeah.
serverless is about results to me, and not having to worry about infrastructure or provider quirks or any of that stuff that sucks up all your time traditionally. But yeah, and then failover use cases, being able to switch around to take advantage of better prices, all that stuff. I think it's exciting time, because at the end of the day, the result is going to be massive developer empowerment.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm excited to see some, multi-provider examples. That'd be cool to see. If anybody watching has anything that they're working on that they are using multiple providers, feel free to share that, and we'll share with the rest of the community. But cool. So that was an awesome in-depth kind of run through of OpenWhisk. I learned a lot. I'm excited to check out the free tier. Maybe I'll upgrade.
Everyone loves the free tier.
But yeah.
Wait. Can we ask James about pricing real quick?
Yeah.
I'm just curious how OpenWhisk is pricing the hosted version, and how competitive it is against Lambda, Cloud Functions, and Azure Functions. Although some of those might not have released their pricing yet, but we all know that one of the biggest draws of this architecture is the pay per execution sub-second billing model. I mean, this is like a super efficient, super disruptive billing model, and it's certainly one of the big attractors to this. And it brings people like David, who are looking for the free tier in all things and don't want to pay for anything. But but everybody is a David. Like this is what attracted me to Lambda initially.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that, and it's this sort of a convergence of all the great ideas.
Yeah.
So microservices, sub-second billing, that you only get charged whenever it actually calls, event-driven, all this stuff together. So anyway, from the cost perspective, how does OpenWhisk compare?
Well, before I answer that, when I've been at conferences on the booths talking to developers, we have what's called swag hunters, people who just come around for the swag, and they just want the t-shirt and they want to go, and they just go to all the vendors. So maybe we'll have kind of serverless hunters, right, who just move between the free tiers really, really quickly and never ever pay for anything. And that should be pretty funny. So the pricing is the same as Lambda for the execution time. It's priced in the same kind of millisecond granularity. I'm trying to think, what is it, 7 cents per something gigabyte second, or it's the same kind of level of pricing for the millisecond that Lambda is. There's no charge to the API gateway stuff at the moment, so that's a big boon, and you can change the memory that you need. So it's basically how many milliseconds of how much memory. A great tool actually is I think it's called like serverlesscalc.com or service calculator, where you can put in your requirements and it'll show you for the different providers. And I submitted the pull request last month for OpenWhisk when it went GA to update the pricing, so you can go in and compare. It seems that for the execution pricing, the providers are all kind of standardizing on that same price, because who's going to be more expensive. So yeah, OpenWhisk is the same as Lambda at the moment. So yeah.
Cool. Awesome. All right, we got a bunch of questions here as well. Austin, do you have any other OpenWhisk related questions before we dive into some of the viewer questions?
I'm not at the moment, but I'm sure I will. I will.
Okay. We'll come back. We will come back to those. All right. So let's see. So we got a question. This is for you, Austin. And this is coming from Twitter @TingusBT. Asks, will serverless support other providers, Azure, etc.? I'm sure this was tweeted before we announced the OpenWhisk one as well. So
yeah. Yes. And we're on that path. We've been on that path for a long time. A great feature of a great developer tool is just sort of choice and freedom. And that's something that we greatly believe in. And if we're here to empower developers, we got to give them options and choices and the freedom to choose. To take advantage of all these great services that the cloud providers are coming out with. via functions, which again I think is the easiest way to start taking advantage of these things. So absolutely, that's like one of our big core missions, and having that on-prem story and integrating with people who also have their version of the on-prem story. So absolutely, and we have a lot of stuff coming out this year, all along this theme.
Cool. Awesome. All right, next question. And this is from Amit on Gitter. He was asking more specifically, like, how do I do vendor packaging with Python? And just the quick answer to that, Amit, is same way you do use your pip package manager with Python. The serverless framework will just kind of wrap that up and deploy it to your provider of choice. So that was an easy one. Okay, here's a good one for everyone to answer. Hey guys, just found out about serverless. I'm amazed. Wonderful framework. I'm trying to do something a bit more complex though, and I don't know where to start. Perhaps you could advise me on where to find best practices. And this is from Catalan on Facebook. Where do you guys go to learn about new serverless stuff and keep up on trends? James, let's start with you.
There's a cool, I hang out in well, too many Slacks these days, but there's a good Slack, I'm trying to find the address of it, called Serverless Forum, which has lots of people involved from the industry, and all the vendors are in there as well, which is pretty cool. So for developers, they can actually talk to the providers and ask questions directly. So I think that's been really useful. It's called Serverless Forum Slack, and there's a channel for every meetup as well. So that's one of the places. Twitter's the other one, following some of the hashtags and seeing what kind of interesting stuff is up to.
Yeah, Twitter's the big one for me. Well, more so before the election in the United States. Now Twitter's just totally focused on politics, so it's hard. But yeah, you can watch the serverless hashtag and keep up with the updates there. The Slack channel, that's a good one. I'm also in a whole bunch of Slack channels. I'm just looking through all of them on a regular basis. Hacker News too. I mean, there's always serverless announcements on there.
We hit the front page this week, right? That was great. That was great to see. Front page for 6 or 7 hours, I think. So it was awesome. I think there was 3 serverless stories on there. So it was Monday was serverless day on Hacker News.
Yeah. We were pretty shocked. We had 2 stories on the front page, which is just so rare.
Yeah, developer advocate, like life goal, right? Front page of Hacker News.
Yep.
Indeed. Yeah, so for Hacker News, quick tip, I use hn.algolia.com. It's Algolia's like version of Hacker News, where you can actually search and filter and like, so yeah, if you just plug in serverless there, you can kind of see, all the previous top kind of posts. It's one of the places I do. And then also I'm searching on GitHub for different serverless projects. Just seeing what people are doing, because it's just really interesting to see like all the different use cases.
Come to Serverless Conf as well. That Serverless Conf is awesome. So well recommend. People are kind of getting involved in the space. They've got 4 of them all over the world now. There's Austin, there's been London, San Francisco, Tokyo. So I had a blast at Serverless London.
Yeah. The A Cloud Guru guys are just killing it in the serverless content space. They're doing a great job.
Yeah. Lots of meetups now as well, so yeah, definitely check those out.
Yeah, hey David, I'm looking at the list of questions here, and I'm going to skip ahead to one because I want to ask James about this too.
Cool.
So someone asked, any examples of having long-running processes via cloud functions, which I assume they just mean functions as a service. For example, polling servers for real-time stock data. And before we answer that, I think it brings up a good point on the potential limitations of functions as a service products right now. And that is that they don't really do long-running processes because they all time out, usually after about 5 minutes. I think they have like a maximum of 5-minute runtime. So does OpenWhisk have any limit on running its actions? And also, does OpenWhisk have any other limitations that developers should be aware of?
Yeah, so I'm just frantically Googling to find out what it is. But I think it's 5 minutes. Let me have a look. Yeah, so it does have a limitation on the time. I think it's either 5 minutes. Yeah, something like, I think it's something like 5 minutes, right? So yeah, a bit like all of them, they're not really designed for processes that are running for hours and hours. That's something to be aware of. Another limitation, I guess, at the moment would be the memory. You can vary the memory between, I think it's 128 and 5.5 gigabyte, but you can't go larger than that, right? So that's something Lambda does do at the moment. Obviously, there's a kind of arbitrary limit. So if you were running it yourself, you could change it. It's not hard-coded through the architecture. It's just something that we are using the one on Bluemix. So there's a couple of things to be aware of. There's a maximum package size for the actions of 48 megabyte, right? So you can use node modules and other modules and that kind of stuff, other artifacts you can bundle up in your deployment package. But it's yeah, it has to be a minimum of 48 meg, which I think Lambda's like 50 meg. So it's kind of seems to be kind of similar. The other kind of things, the API gateway is still a relatively experimental feature. It came out at the end of last year. So they're moving really rapidly and adding lots of new features, but it's not feature complete. It's not kind of feature parity complete to something like API gateway on Lambda, which is its own cloud service. The hosted version on IBM Bluemix, they're integrating with our kind of big API gateway service, which has a lot of those extra features. So yeah, that's something to be kind of aware of. Yeah, it's kind of a couple of kind of things to think about.
Do you have any tips for trying to get away with long-running processes on OpenWhisk?
Yeah, do I have any tips? So one of the I guess it depends. Yeah, it's not super easy. One of the event sources in OpenWhisk is Kafka, which is pretty cool. So you can process Kafka messages, and you could control the granularity of kind of messages coming in. I think it's one of the interesting things to think about is how do you handle failures in a serverless platform. So, for example, imagine you've defined this what I call a sequence, which is this primitive in the platform which says call functions A, B, and C in order. The platform handles invocation and passing a response back. The functions don't need to know about each other. But what happens in the middle of a sequence if one of them just dies and blows up, right, throws an error? What should you do in that kind of case? And so we've been debating on GitHub in the issue today about what you should do, right? And whether you can attach like almost like a promised catch method. So you can say if we exit the normal path, I want a failure mode that kicks in to be able to handle that. So I could imagine you might have something where you have your sequence to process some data, and if the timeout occurs and it jumps out of the sequence because of the finished processing, your kind of recovery function would run, which would then reschedule it or something, or split it up into new data and put it back on the queue. So I think that would be a really neat feature, and we're just kind of thrashing out on the issues how it's going to work at the moment.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I've seen for longer running processes, like you can do like recursive function calls, which can be super dangerous. You just get into this infinite credit card loop. And like the other kind of solution that I saw was so if you do have some super computational long running process, I mean you could sitting there waiting for that job to run, you could have a Lambda or a OpenWhisk function in front of it that spins up that infrastructure under the hood to run that long running process that spins down. There are ways around it. But yeah, that is, the kind of current limitation in the.
Yeah, I guess one way to handle, if you're kind of doing stuff off a queue, I guess one way would be to obviously what the timeout is going to be and set a scheduler so that 30 seconds before the timeout you get your function to be invoked. That then, if possible, then we'll dump it back on the queue so when it exits, something else can pick it up. Would be a kind of hacky way around that, but yeah.
Exactly. All right, cool. So we're coming up on the hour here. Let's close it out. James, I wanted to ask you, like, what excites you the most about this kind of emerging serverless space that we find ourselves in?
Well, I mean, it just moves so rapidly, right? I think last year you saw the providers coming out with their platforms, and now developers have choice. There's lots of more kind of open source solutions. What I think will be interesting this year is the kind of developer experience tooling that seems to be coming out, right? So I think people find it easy to get going with a couple of functions, and then when they build bigger apps, they can be like, oh, how do I manage this, and how do I do composition and error handling and stuff. So I think you'll see some really interesting tooling come out. So around just whole developer experience of building apps and composition. Something that I think was really cool was we announced a debugger for OpenWhisk recently, which allows you to connect your Chrome and the Chrome debugger for JavaScript up to a live function running in the cloud. So you can step through it as if it's just a normal function running locally, which I think is awesome, right? And is a huge improvement. Everyone, I think, when they start with serverless platforms, is like, oh, how do you debug stuff? And you're like, console.log, it's 1990 all over again. And so I think, have it, and they're like, what? What is this? So yeah, that was a wicked project that Nick Mitchell at IBM did, and it's, again, just up on GitHub. You can go and pull it down and start to use it. And I think, what I think will be really exciting to see all these new cool tools that are coming out to make it easier to build serverless apps and give you a kind of the experience that you expect from building something locally.
Cool. All right, so yeah, we're running out of time. So where can people find you, James, if they want to connect or learn more about OpenWhisk?
They can find me on the internet. They can find me on Twitter at Thomas J. So yeah, just follow me and at me or DM me, and I can help you out with anything kind of OpenWhisk related. For OpenWhisk, obviously the GitHub repo is where everything's going to be, or we have a Slack group like everyone does that you can come and hang out and talk to us, and details are in the GitHub repo. So yeah, just follow me on Twitter. I'm constantly, as they say, you can banging on about serverless, and I just tweet about it all the time at OpenWhisk, and you can just ask me anything. I'll hook you up with the people to talk to.
Cool. What about you, Austin? Where can people find you? I was going to give out your personal.
So
you can find me at serverless.com. You can find me in the Gitter channel. Twitter. At Austin Collins, Austin spelled with the E, A-U-S-T-E-N. But definitely check out at Go Serverless, our company Twitter account. That's where we do all the cool announcements and stuff.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, everybody, thanks for joining. We're going to be doing office hours basically every 2 weeks now. So we have one coming up in 2 weeks with the guys over at Cloud Academy. Should be pretty awesome. And yeah, if you want to connect with me, I'm at David Wells on Twitter. Thanks for joining us on Office Hours.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, James. Well done. See you guys.
Bye.